The USS Leviathan cut through the dark Atlantic waters like a steel behemoth, its nuclear-powered engines pushing the massive aircraft carrier through 20-foot swells with the steady determination that had made it the flagship of the Sixth Fleet. At 192 feet long and displacing over 100,000 tons, the Nimitz-class supercarrier was home to nearly 6,000 sailors, each playing their part in the complex symphony of modern naval warfare. But tonight, in the officers' wardroom on the second deck, the only symphony anyone cared about was the clatter of silverware against China and the comfortable buzz of conversation that followed a successful Mediterranean patrol. The monthly Heritage Night celebration was in full swing, a tradition that brought together the ship's senior leadership to celebrate the Navy's proud history while building the camaraderie essential to effective command at sea. The wardroom had been decorated with maritime artifacts and historical photographs, while white-coated stewards moved efficiently between tables, ensuring that every officer's glass remained filled and every plate promptly cleared. It was a scene of military elegance that spoke to centuries of naval tradition, where protocol and hierarchy created a comfortable order that every participant understood instinctively. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen adjusted her service-dress blue uniform and surveyed the gathering with satisfaction. As the ship's morale and welfare officer, she had spent weeks organizing this event, coordinating with the supply department to ensure the finest cuisine available at sea, working with the communications team to arrange live video calls with families back home, and even managing to procure a selection of wines that had somehow survived the ship's prohibition on alcohol through diplomatic channels she preferred not to discuss in detail. "Outstanding work, Sarah," said Captain Robert Chin, the ship's commanding officer, as he approached her position near the ornate upright piano that served as the wardroom's centerpiece. At 52, Captain Chin embodied the best traditions of naval leadership, decisive in crisis, thoughtful in planning, and absolutely devoted to the welfare of every sailor under his command. His 28 years of service had taken him from nuclear submarine operations in the Pacific to carrier command in the Mediterranean, and he had never lost sight of the fundamental truth that a ship's greatest asset was its people. "Thank you, Captain," Chen replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from successful completion of a complex logistical challenge. "I think the crew needed this. The last deployment cycle was particularly demanding, and morale indicators showed we needed something to reconnect our leadership team with why we chose naval service." Captain Chin nodded thoughtfully. The Leviathan had just completed a grueling 6-month deployment that included counter-terrorism operations off the coast of North Africa, humanitarian assistance following a devastating earthquake in Greece, and the complex diplomatic dance of freedom of navigation patrols that had brought them uncomfortably close to hostile naval forces on more than one occasion. His officers had performed magnificently under pressure, but the accumulated stress of modern naval operations required careful attention to prevent the kind of burnout that could compromise both safety and effectiveness. "The piano was an inspired touch," the captain continued, running his fingers along the instrument's polished mahogany surface. "Where did you manage to find a Steinway Grand on short notice?" Chen smiled mysteriously. "The Naples base commander owed me a favor from that supply crisis we helped resolve last year. It turns out his wife is a classical music enthusiast, and she insisted on lending us her personal instrument when she heard about our heritage celebration." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the wardroom's main entrance, where the duty petty officer was engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion with someone just outside the compartment. Captain Chin frowned, his command instincts immediately alert to any disruption that might affect the evening's carefully planned proceedings. "What's the situation, Petty Officer Martinez?" he called across the room. "Sir, we have a junior sailor requesting permission to enter the wardroom," Martinez replied, his voice carrying the uncomfortable tension of someone caught between conflicting priorities. "He claims there's been a galley fire that's disrupted meal service to enlisted berthing, and he's asking for access to food." The conversations throughout the wardroom began to fade as officers turned their attention to the developing situation. Captain Chin approached the entrance, his mind already running through the protocols for emergency food distribution and the logistics of caring for nearly 5,000 enlisted personnel in case of galley casualties. "How extensive was the fire?" he asked, his command voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Sir, according to the duty officer, it was contained to one of the main serving lines. No injuries, but they've shut down all meal service as a precautionary measure while damage control teams ensure the ventilation systems are clear." Captain Chin nodded grimly. A galley fire aboard an aircraft carrier was always a serious concern, given the ship's reliance on complex food service operations to maintain crew readiness. Even a minor incident could disrupt meal schedules for thousands of people, creating a cascading series of problems that could affect everything from watch rotations to flight operations. "Very well. Have the duty officer coordinate with supply to establish emergency feeding stations using backup facilities. And get me a full report on the extent of the damage and timeline for restoration of normal services." "Aye, sir. But what about the sailor requesting entry?" It was then that a young voice called out from the passageway beyond the wardroom entrance. Clear and respectful, but carrying an undertone of genuine desperation that made every officer in the compartment pause involuntarily. "Can I play for food?" The words cut through the elegant atmosphere like a distress signal cutting through radio static. Conversations ceased entirely as heads turned toward the entrance, where a young sailor stood silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent lighting of the ship's passageway. He was slight in build, probably no more than 19 or 20 years old, with the kind of earnest expression that marked him as someone still adjusting to the realities of naval service. His utility uniform bore the crisp creases that indicated recent arrival aboard ship, while his name tape read Rivera, in the standard black letters that identified thousands of sailors throughout the fleet. Seaman recruit Marcus Rivera stepped hesitantly into the wardroom, his eyes immediately drawn to the Steinway grand piano that dominated the compartment's far corner. Despite his obvious nervousness, there was something in his posture that suggested an inner strength, incongruous with his junior rank and apparent youth. He clutched his white hat in his hands like a protective talisman, but his gaze fixed on the piano with an intensity that spoke of deep familiarity and profound longing. "How did that boot get in here?" whispered Chief Petty Officer Patricia Hayes, her weathered hands tightening around her coffee cup. At 52, she had spent 30 years rising through the Navy's enlisted ranks before accepting a commission, and her experience had taught her to be suspicious of junior personnel who stepped outside the normal chain of command. "This is a closed event for senior staff only." The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The Heritage Night celebration was specifically designed to honor the Navy's commitment to taking care of its people. Yet here stood a young sailor who clearly represented exactly the kind of personnel they claimed to value most highly. Marcus had been aboard the Leviathan for only 3 weeks, assigned to the ship's communications division after completing basic training at Great Lakes Naval Station. The galley fire had caught him during what should have been dinner hour, and something desperate inside him had compelled him to seek out the officers' gathering he had heard announced over the ship's general announcing system. Commander Victoria Sterling rose from her position at the head table, her movement commanding immediate attention from everyone in the wardroom. At 45, she embodied everything the modern Navy claimed to value. She was a Naval Academy graduate with advanced degrees in international relations and strategic studies, a veteran of multiple combat deployments, and the recipient of numerous awards for leadership and professional excellence. Her rise through the ranks had been meteoric, and she was widely regarded as destined for flag rank before retirement. "Seaman Rivera," she said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority that came from commanding complex operations in high-stakes environments. "This compartment is restricted to personnel of lieutenant rank and above. The proper procedure for requesting assistance with meal arrangements is through your division officer, not by approaching senior staff directly. Her tone was not unkind, but it carried the absolute certainty of someone who had spent decades within a system where order and hierarchy were not merely preferences, but absolute necessities for effective operation. The Navy's emphasis on chain of command was not arbitrary tradition, but practical wisdom earned through centuries of combat operations where confusion or unauthorized communication could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Ma'am, I understand the protocol," Marcus replied, his voice gaining unexpected firmness despite his obvious nervousness. "But the division officer is currently dealing with the damage control situation, and I haven't eaten in over 18 hours. I was hoping that if I could provide some entertainment value for your gathering, you might allow me access to some of the food that would otherwise go to waste." A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled officers. The idea of a junior enlisted sailor providing entertainment for senior staff struck most of them as presumptuous at best and potentially ridiculous at worst. Naval service was built on clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and the notion that someone at the very bottom of the hierarchy might have something to offer those at the top contradicted their fundamental understanding of how military organizations functioned effectively. "He thinks he can play piano," scoffed Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, the ship's supply officer, whose own musical experience was limited to occasionally humming popular songs while reviewing inventory reports. "These kids watch too many movies and think they can do anything. Next thing you know, he'll be claiming he can navigate by the stars or land aircraft on the flight deck." Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the morale officer who had organized the evening's events, shook her head with what appeared to be genuine pity mixed with professional concern. "It's touching how optimistic these young sailors are, but we have to be realistic about capabilities and appropriate boundaries. Military service requires understanding your role and operating within established parameters." But Marcus Rivera did not look down or retreat in the face of their skepticism. There was something in his bearing that seemed to transcend his obvious youth and junior status, a quiet dignity that suggested he possessed knowledge or experience that none of the assembled officers suspected. His fingers moved unconsciously at his sides, as if playing invisible melodies, a subtle habit he had developed during the long, lonely nights of his childhood when music had been his only escape from a world that often seemed hostile and unforgiving. Captain Chin observed the unfolding scene with the careful attention he applied to all potentially significant developments aboard his ship. Something about the young sailor's demeanor intrigued him in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The way Marcus's eyes had fixed on the piano suggested not casual interest, but profound recognition, the kind of connection that spoke of deep history and intimate familiarity. In nearly 3 decades of naval service, Captain Chin had developed reliable instincts for identifying exceptional individuals, whether in combat, leadership, or specialized technical skills, and something about this seemingly ordinary seaman triggered those same intuitive responses. "Commander Sterling," Captain Chin said quietly, approaching the group that had formed around Marcus. "Perhaps we should allow him to attempt whatever he has in mind. After all, our gathering tonight is supposed to celebrate the Navy's commitment to recognizing and developing talent wherever it emerges." Commander Sterling's laugh was sharp and immediately dismissive, carrying the kind of absolute certainty that came from years of successful leadership in environments where decisiveness was valued above all other qualities. "Captain, with all due respect, look at this sailor. Personnel from his background don't have access to the kind of musical education that would allow them to perform at a level appropriate for senior staff. This is probably some misguided attempt to gain special attention or favorable treatment." What none of the assembled officers could possibly have known was that Marcus Rivera had grown up in a household where classical music was not merely entertainment, but the very foundation of daily existence. His grandfather, Miguel Eduardo Rivera, had been one of the most gifted classical pianists of his generation, a virtuoso whose potential had been systematically thwarted by the social barriers facing Hispanic musicians during the 1960s and 1970s. Unable to gain admission to prestigious conservatories or access to the concert stages where his talents belonged, Miguel had channeled his frustrated dreams into teaching, transforming his modest apartment into a musical sanctuary where children from his community discovered that classical music was not the exclusive domain of the wealthy and privileged. "Music is the universal language, mijo," Miguel used to tell his grandson as they sat together at the battered upright piano that dominated the living room of their small home. "When you play from your heart, people listen with their souls, not their prejudices. The greatest musicians in history understood that music belongs to everyone who has the courage to claim it." For the first 18 years of his life, Marcus had absorbed not just musical technique, but an entire philosophy of artistic expression that transcended social boundaries and economic limitations. Miguel's teaching method was rigorous and uncompromising, demanding not just technical precision, but emotional authenticity that could only come from understanding music as a form of communication rather than mere performance. Every afternoon after school, Marcus would find his grandfather waiting at the piano, ready to guide him through the works of Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, and dozens of other composers whose music formed the foundation of classical tradition. But Miguel Rivera was more than just a music teacher. He was a historian of struggle and triumph, a philosopher of resilience who understood that artistic excellence could serve as both personal salvation and social transformation. He taught Marcus that every piece of music told a story, not just of its composer's intentions, but of the cultural forces that had shaped both the creation and reception of artistic work throughout history. "When you play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, Miguel would say, his weathered hands demonstrating the subtle dynamics that brought the music to life, "you're not just playing notes on a keyboard. You're channeling the longing of an entire nation for freedom, the pain of exile, the hope that someday justice and beauty will triumph over oppression and ignorance." These lessons continued through Marcus's childhood and adolescence, creating a foundation of musical understanding that was both technically sophisticated and emotionally profound. By the time he reached high school, he was performing at a level that would have qualified him for admission to any conservatory in the country had his family possessed the financial resources and social connections necessary to navigate those exclusive institutions. But when Miguel Rivera died suddenly of a heart attack during Marcus's senior year, the young man's world collapsed in ways that went far beyond simple grief. Without his grandfather's income from private teaching, the small apartment that had been their musical sanctuary was lost to foreclosure. Marcus found himself adrift in a foster care system that had no understanding of or interest in his extraordinary abilities, living in group homes where his attempts to maintain his musical skills were seen as pretentious affectations rather than essential elements of his identity. Military service became not just an option, but his only viable path forward, a means of escape from circumstances that threatened to destroy everything his grandfather had worked to build. Marcus enlisted with the understanding that his musical talents would have to remain hidden, private comforts in a world dedicated to duty, discipline, and the practical demands of national defense. But now, standing in the Leviathan's wardroom surrounded by officers who looked at him with expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright dismissal, all of those carefully suppressed aspects of his identity were struggling to emerge. The sight of the Steinway grand piano had triggered memories and emotions he had spent months trying to control, reminding him of everything he had lost and everything he still might become. Commander Sterling crossed her arms and regarded Marcus with the kind of theatrical patience typically reserved for dealing with particularly troublesome junior personnel. "Very well, Seaman Rivera," she said, her voice dripping with the condescension that came from absolute certainty about the outcome of what she perceived as a pointless exercise. Since you seem so determined to disrupt our gathering, let's make a deal that will settle this matter once and for all." The assembled officers drew closer, sensing the potential for the kind of entertainment that came from watching overconfident junior personnel learn important lessons about military hierarchy and the dangers of exceeding one's capabilities. Commander Sterling enjoyed being the center of attention, particularly when she could demonstrate the kind of firm but fair leadership that the Navy's officer evaluation system rewarded so highly. "First condition," Sterling announced, raising a perfectly manicured finger that somehow looked incongruous in the military environment despite her flawless adherence to grooming standards. "You will play exactly one piece of music, and we will select which composition you attempt. There will be no negotiation about the choice, and no excuses if you find our selection too challenging for your alleged abilities." She paused for dramatic effect, allowing the weight of her authority to settle over the compartment like morning fog over calm seas. The other officers watched with varying degrees of anticipation and discomfort, some beginning to suspect that this demonstration might be unnecessarily harsh even by the standards of military discipline. "Second condition," Sterling continued, her voice gaining the kind of formal precision that characterized official Navy communications. "If you manage to play our selected piece with reasonable competence, and I emphasize that our standards for reasonable are quite high, you will receive access to the food remaining from tonight's gathering, along with arrangements for proper meals until galley services are restored." The offer was more generous than many of the assembled officers had expected, reflecting Sterling's awareness that her actions were being observed and evaluated by her peers and superiors. But her next words carried the unmistakable threat that transformed charity into punishment. "However," she said, her smile taking on a sharp edge that several of the more experienced officers recognized as a warning sign, "when you fail to meet our expectations, as we all know you inevitably will, you will return immediately to your berthing compartment and never again attempt to gain unauthorized access to spaces or events above your current rank and qualifications." "That seems unnecessarily harsh," whispered Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez from his position near the back of the group, but his voice was immediately drowned out by murmurs of approval from other officers who saw Sterling's proposal as an appropriate lesson in military discipline and the importance of understanding one's place within the hierarchy. Marcus remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the piano with an intensity that was beginning to make some of the more observant officers feel vaguely uncomfortable. There was something unsettling about his complete lack of visible anxiety or doubt, as if he possessed knowledge about the upcoming challenge that none of them shared. Memories were flooding through his consciousness like water rushing through a broken dam, carrying him back to countless afternoons in his grandfather's living room, where music had been both refuge and revelation. He could hear Miguel's voice as clearly as if the old man were standing beside him in the Leviathan's wardroom. "When people try to diminish you, mijo, let the music speak truths they cannot deny. Music recognizes no rank, no prejudice, no artificial barriers. It only knows authenticity and excellence." "I accept your terms, ma'am," Marcus said simply, his voice carrying a clarity and confidence that made Captain Chin's command instincts tingle with increased attention. "Excellent." Commander Sterling clapped her hands together with obvious satisfaction. "Now we need to select an appropriate piece for our aspiring musician." She looked around the wardroom, her gaze settling on Lieutenant Morrison, whose limited piano experience made him seem like the perfect choice for choosing a suitably challenging composition. "Morrison, you've had some musical training. What would be an appropriate test of this sailor's claimed abilities?" Lieutenant Morrison straightened with obvious pleasure at being included in the demonstration. His own piano experience was limited to childhood lessons and occasional recreational playing, but he enjoyed being recognized as having cultural sophistication beyond his primary expertise in supply management. "How about Beethoven's Für Elise?" he suggested with a smile that was clearly intended to be both generous and subtly mocking. It's probably the most famous piano piece in the world. Anyone who has ever had serious musical training should be able to handle it without difficulty. The choice drew knowing nods from several other officers, who recognized it as the perfect trap for an overconfident junior sailor. For Elise was universally known among casual piano students as a relatively simple piece, but playing it with the technical precision and musical understanding required for public performance demanded years of serious study and practice. It was the ideal selection, accessible enough that failure couldn't be attributed to unreasonable difficulty, but demanding enough that any inadequacies in technique or preparation would be immediately obvious to even musically inexperienced listeners. "Perfect selection," Commander Sterling applauded, her satisfaction evident to everyone in the wardroom. "A composition that any sailor who has received genuine classical training should be able to perform competently. There can be no excuses for failure, and no claims that we've been unfair in our expectations." Marcus nodded his acceptance and began walking toward the piano with steps that seemed charged with quiet determination and growing confidence. Each movement carried a sense of purpose that was beginning to make some of the assembled officers feel increasingly uncertain about what they were about to witness. There was something profoundly unsettling about the young sailor's complete absence of visible nervousness or doubt, as if he were approaching not a potential humiliation, but a long-awaited opportunity to reveal something important about himself. When Marcus reached the piano bench and began adjusting its height with precise, economical movements that spoke of long familiarity with the instrument, Captain Chin felt a chill of recognition run down his spine. Those were not the uncertain gestures of someone unfamiliar with piano performance, but the automatic habits of someone who had spent thousands of hours perfecting the physical mechanics of professional playing. "Look at that," Commander Sterling sneered to the officers nearest her position. "He doesn't even know how to sit properly at the keyboard. This is going to be over before it begins." But Captain Chin had observed exactly the opposite. The adjustment of the bench height, the positioning of his body relative to the keyboard, the way Marcus's hands hovered above the keys in perfect classical position, these were all details that required years of rigorous training to master. Every element of his preparation spoke of someone with extensive, serious musical education. As Marcus settled into position at the piano, his mind was flooded with memories that carried him far from the Leviathan's wardroom to a small apartment where an elderly Hispanic man had patiently guided him through the mysteries of musical expression and technical excellence. Miguel Rivera had been more than just a grandfather and teacher. He had been a keeper of dreams deferred but never abandoned, a guardian of possibilities that transcended social limitations and economic barriers. "Remember, mijo," Miguel used to say as he positioned Marcus's hands correctly on the keyboard, "every great pianist understands that technique is only the foundation for something much more important. Music is not about impressing people with your abilities, it's about communicating emotions and experiences that connect us all as human beings." Miguel's teaching had been comprehensive and uncompromising, covering not just the mechanical aspects of piano performance, but the historical and cultural contexts that gave meaning to every piece of music. He had taught Marcus to understand Beethoven not just as a composer of beautiful melodies, but as a revolutionary who had used music to express ideas about human dignity and individual worth that challenged the social hierarchies of his era. "When you play Für Elise," Miguel had explained during one of their afternoon lessons, "you are channeling Beethoven's belief that true nobility comes not from titles or wealth, but from the capacity to create beauty and meaning in the world. This piece may sound simple, but it contains all of Beethoven's philosophy about what makes human life valuable and significant." Those lessons had continued throughout Marcus's childhood and adolescence, creating a foundation of musical understanding that was both technically rigorous and philosophically sophisticated. By the time he graduated from high school, he was performing classical repertoire at a level that would have qualified him for admission to any conservatory in the country had circumstances permitted him to pursue that path. But when Miguel died and Marcus found himself navigating the foster care system and eventually military service, he had been forced to suppress those aspects of his identity that seemed incompatible with his new circumstances. The Navy offered structure, purpose, and the promise of educational opportunities, but it seemed to have no place for the kind of artistic excellence his grandfather had cultivated with such patience and dedication. Now, however, surrounded by officers who viewed him with expressions ranging from amusement to barely concealed contempt, Marcus felt all of those carefully controlled aspects of his personality struggling to emerge. The sight of the Steinway grand piano had awakened something in him that months of military discipline had not been able to eliminate entirely. "We're waiting, Seaman Rivera," Commander Sterling said, drumming her fingers impatiently against the wardroom's polished table. "Or have you realized that you may have overestimated your abilities?" Marcus took a deep breath and placed his hands on the keyboard with movements that were both gentle and supremely confident. The moment his fingers made contact with the keys, an electric shock of recognition ran through his entire body. After months without access to a real piano, feeling the precise response of a perfectly maintained instrument was like rediscovering a fundamental part of himself that had been dormant but never truly lost. The first note of Für Elise emerged from the Steinway with a crystalline purity that made every conversation in the wardroom stop instantly. It was not the hesitant, uncertain sound that the assembled officers had expected to hear, but a note played with the confidence and technical precision of someone who understood every nuance of both the instrument and the music with intimate familiarity. Captain Chin moved closer to the piano, his professional curiosity now fully aroused by what he was witnessing. That opening note had been produced with impeccable technique, perfect attack, controlled sustain, and the kind of tonal quality that came only from years of serious training under expert instruction. "Probably just luck," Commander Sterling murmured, but her voice had lost some of its previous confidence and carried a note of uncertainty that several other officers noticed immediately. Marcus continued with the famous opening melody of Beethoven's composition, and every subsequent note that flowed from his hands was like a small miracle of musical expression. There was no hesitation, no technical uncertainty, no sign of the amateur improvisation that everyone had expected to witness. Instead, the music emerged with the kind of natural flow that indicated not just technical competence, but profound musical understanding and years of dedicated practice. But there was something even more remarkable happening beyond mere technical proficiency. Marcus was bringing an emotional maturity to his interpretation that left Captain Chin completely stunned. The way he shaped the melodic phrases, controlled the subtle dynamics that gave life to Beethoven's composition, and allowed the silences between notes to speak as eloquently as the music itself. These were the hallmarks of a mature artist, not an untrained amateur trying to impress senior officers. The wardroom had fallen into complete silence. Coffee cups remained motionless in officers' hands as conversations ceased entirely. Even the stewards who had been quietly clearing tables stopped their activities, mesmerized by the music that was transforming the utilitarian military compartment into something approaching a concert hall. Commander Sterling felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with seasickness or the ship's motion through heavy Atlantic swells. This was not proceeding according to her expectations or plans. The public lesson in military discipline and appropriate behavior that she had orchestrated was transforming into something entirely beyond her control, something that threatened to undermine the very assumptions about hierarchy and merit that she had spent her entire career defending. As Marcus navigated the more complex middle section of Für Elise, where Beethoven's deceptively simple melody gives way to passages requiring genuine technical virtuosity, Captain Chin felt his pulse increase with a mixture of amazement and growing concern about the implications of what he was witnessing. The young sailor was not just playing the notes correctly, he was interpreting them with the kind of musical sophistication that typically required decades to develop. The descending arpeggios that challenged even advanced piano students flowed from Marcus's fingers like water flowing over smooth stone, each note perfectly placed and weighted to create the maximum musical effect. His control of the sustain pedal was flawless, adding exactly the right amount of resonance to support the melodic line without creating the muddy confusion that plagued less experienced performers. "This is impossible," Captain Chin whispered to Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, who was standing beside him with an expression of complete disbelief. Where could a junior enlisted sailor have possibly received this level of training? Rodriguez, who had studied piano as a child and maintained an active interest in classical music throughout his naval career, could only shake his head in amazement. "Captain, what we're hearing represents thousands of hours of practice under expert instruction. This isn't something you can learn from YouTube videos or casual lessons. This is conservatory-level performance." The implications of that observation were staggering for everyone in the wardroom who was sophisticated enough to understand them. If Marcus Rivera possessed this level of musical training and ability, what other assumptions about their junior personnel might be equally flawed? How many other exceptional individuals were serving in positions that failed to utilize their full potential simply because their backgrounds or appearances didn't match conventional expectations about talent and achievement? Commander Sterling, sensing that the carefully controlled narrative she had established was beginning to collapse around her, tried desperately to regain some measure of authority over the unfolding situation. "He must have memorized this piece from recordings," she said loudly enough for other officers to hear, her voice carrying a note of desperation that contradicted her usual confident demeanor. "These young people can reproduce anything they've heard often enough, but that doesn't mean they have genuine musical understanding." But even as she spoke, Sterling realized that her explanation sounded increasingly hollow and unconvincing. What Marcus was demonstrating transcended mere mechanical reproduction of familiar music. He was bringing interpretive insights and emotional depth to Beethoven's composition that could only come from genuine musical education and, more importantly, the kind of lived experience with hardship and triumph that informed the greatest artistic expression throughout history. Marcus reached the climactic return of the main melody, where Beethoven brings back the opening theme with renewed intensity and complexity after the virtuosic middle section. His hands moved across the keyboard with a familiarity and confidence that spoke of intimate knowledge built through years of dedicated practice, the kind of relationship with the instrument that could not be faked or imitated. As the music flowed through him, Marcus felt the walls between his present circumstances and his buried past dissolving entirely. He could hear his grandfather Miguel's voice echoing through the years, with wisdom that transcended the immediate situation. "Music is not about proving yourself to people who have already decided you have no value, mijo. It is about claiming your rightful place in the world and insisting that your voice deserves to be heard." Miguel Rivera had been more than just a teacher and grandfather to Marcus. He had been a living embodiment of resilience and determination, a man who had refused to allow social barriers and economic limitations to extinguish his passion for musical excellence. Born in 1942 to a family of migrant agricultural workers, Miguel had discovered his gift for music almost by accident when a sympathetic teacher at an underfunded elementary school had allowed him to experiment with an old piano that was gathering dust in an unused classroom. From that humble beginning, Miguel had taught himself to read music, developed his technique through endless hours of practice, and eventually earned a scholarship to study at a small regional college where his extraordinary abilities were finally recognized by professional musicians. But the larger world of classical music in the 1960s remained largely closed to Hispanic performers, regardless of their talent or training, forcing Miguel to build his career through teaching and local performances that never provided the recognition his abilities deserved. Instead of becoming bitter or abandoning music entirely, Miguel had channeled his frustrated ambitions into creating opportunities for the next generation. His small apartment had become an informal conservatory where children from his community discovered that classical music was not the exclusive property of wealthy white families, but a universal language that belonged to anyone with the dedication and courage to master it. "Every time you sit down at the piano," Miguel used to tell Marcus during their afternoon lessons, "you are continuing a conversation that began centuries ago with composers who believed that music could express the deepest truths about human experience. When you play their music with understanding and respect, you become part of that conversation, regardless of where you come from or what obstacles you have had to overcome." Those lessons had continued throughout Marcus's childhood and adolescence, creating not just technical proficiency, but a philosophical understanding of music as a form of communication that transcended social boundaries and cultural limitations. Miguel had taught him that every great composition told a story not just about its composer's intentions, but about the universal human experiences of struggle, hope, loss, and triumph that connected all people across time and circumstance. But when Miguel died suddenly during Marcus's senior year of high school, the young man had lost not just his grandfather and teacher, but his entire world of musical possibility. The small apartment that had been their sanctuary was lost to economic necessities, and Marcus found himself adrift in a foster care system that had no understanding of or interest in his extraordinary abilities. Military service had offered structure and purpose, but it had also required him to suppress those aspects of his identity that seemed incompatible with the practical demands of naval operations. The Navy valued technical competence, physical fitness, and the ability to follow orders under pressure. But it seemed to have no place for the kind of artistic excellence that had been the defining characteristic of his relationship with his grandfather. Now, however, as he played the final passages of Für Elise with a delicacy and precision that made several officers hold their breath involuntarily, Marcus felt all of those carefully suppressed aspects of his personality emerging with unstoppable force. The music was calling forth everything he had tried to hide, everything he had been taught to believe had no place in his new life as a naval service member. When the last notes of Beethoven's composition faded into the absolute silence of the wardroom, Marcus kept his hands suspended above the keyboard for a long moment, as if reluctant to break the magical connection between himself and the instrument that had restored him to a sense of identity he had thought was lost forever. Then slowly, deliberately, he turned on the piano bench to face the assembled officers, and in that movement, something fundamental had changed. The shy, desperate recruit who had begged for food had disappeared entirely, replaced by a young man who had just reclaimed his rightful place in the world through the universal language of musical excellence that recognized no barriers of rank, race, or social circumstance. The silence in the wardroom stretched on for what seemed like an eternity, broken finally by Captain Chin's hands coming together in slow, respectful applause that echoed through the compartment like distant thunder. Gradually, other officers joined in until the USS Leviathan's wardroom vibrated with genuine appreciation and amazement that transcended military protocol and challenged every assumption they had brought to the evening's encounter. Commander Sterling looked around the wardroom with growing panic. Her carefully orchestrated demonstration of military discipline and proper hierarchy transformed into something that threatened to undermine her authority and professional reputation. Worse still, she could see in the expressions of her fellow officers a question that haunted her understanding of leadership and merit. If they had been so completely wrong about this sailor, What other assumptions about their personnel might be equally flawed and unjust? Marcus remained seated calmly at the piano, allowing the applause to wash over him like a cleansing rain after months of drought and suppression. But behind his composed exterior, something was crystallizing that would change not just his own trajectory, but the entire dynamic aboard the USS Leviathan. He had proven his point about musical ability, but this was only the beginning of a revelation that would force everyone present to examine their most fundamental beliefs about talent, worth, and the complex relationship between social expectations and individual potential. Captain Chin approached the piano with the careful steps of someone approaching something sacred and unexpected, his expression mixing professional admiration with the growing realization that this encounter was about to reveal truths that extended far beyond musical performance. "Seaman Rivera," he said, his voice carrying a tremor of emotion that was unusual for a seasoned commanding officer. "I must ask you a question that I suspect may change how we understand this entire situation. Where did you receive your musical training?" The question hung in the air like the last echoes of Beethoven's composition, and Marcus understood that his answer would determine not just his own future, but potentially the futures of countless other service members whose abilities and potential had been systematically overlooked by institutions that measured worth through narrow, conventional criteria. "My grandfather taught me, sir," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to find strength in honesty, even when truth might be uncomfortable for those in positions of authority. "Miguel Eduardo Rivera. He believed that music was the one thing no one could ever take away from me, regardless of circumstances." The name struck Captain Chin like a physical blow, causing him to take an involuntary step backward as recognition dawned in his eyes. "Miguel Rivera," he repeated slowly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You're Miguel Rivera's grandson?" The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Captain Chin covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed by the implications of what he had just learned. "Dear God," he whispered. "Miguel Rivera was one of the most exceptional classical pianists this country has ever produced. He should have been performing at Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center, but the barriers of his era prevented him from receiving the recognition his extraordinary talents deserved." Commander Sterling watched this exchange with mounting confusion and growing unease. The captain's reaction suggested knowledge and context that she lacked entirely, threatening to undermine the narrative she had constructed about the evening's events. "Captain, what are you talking about? Who exactly is Miguel Rivera?" Captain Chin turned to face her with an expression that mixed incredulity with barely contained disappointment in her ignorance of musical history and cultural achievement. "Commander, Miguel Rivera was a legend within classical music circles throughout the Southwest and beyond. A virtuoso performer who was systematically excluded from major conservatories and concert venues because of ethnic prejudice, despite possessing technical abilities and interpretive insights that surpassed most of his contemporaries, who enjoyed successful professional careers." The captain's voice gained intensity as he continued, his usual measured demeanor giving way to passionate advocacy for historical justice. "Rivera became one of the most respected private instructors in the country, training dozens of students who went on to professional careers with major symphony orchestras and as soloists on the international concert circuit. His pedagogical methods were studied at universities, and his approach to developing both technical precision and emotional authenticity influenced an entire generation of music educators." The assembled officers murmured among themselves as this information sank in, many beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple demonstration of amateur musical ability. If Marcus Rivera was indeed the grandson and student of such a distinguished figure, his performance represented not just individual talent, but the continuation of a profound musical legacy that had been preserved and transmitted across generations despite enormous social obstacles. "But that was decades ago," Commander Sterling protested, her voice carrying increasing defensiveness as she sensed the foundation of her authority beginning to shift beneath her feet. Even if this story is accurate, it doesn't change the fact that he violated military protocol by entering a restricted area without authorization. It was at that moment that Marcus rose from the piano bench with fluid grace, his movements reflecting the same precision and confidence he had demonstrated in his musical performance. For the first time since entering the wardroom, he allowed his complete personality to emerge without the protective camouflage of military deference and junior rank submission. "Commander Sterling," he said, his voice carrying a new authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone in the compartment. "You are absolutely correct about one thing. I should not be here tonight." He paused, allowing the silence to settle over the wardroom like morning mist over calm waters. "I should be at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., where I have a solo recital scheduled with the National Symphony Orchestra next month." The revelation fell on the wardroom like a depth charge, creating waves of shock and disbelief that rippled through the assembled officers. Commander Sterling felt the deck plates shift beneath her feet, as if the carrier had taken an unexpected wave beam on. "My name is Marcus Eduardo Rivera," he continued with growing confidence and unmistakable pride. "I am the youngest classical pianist ever accepted into the Juilliard School's pre-college division, graduating summa cum laude at age 17. I am also the current winner of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition for performers under 21, and I hold fellowships from both the Chopin Foundation and the Beethoven Society of America." The silence in the wardroom was so complete that the distant sounds of flight deck operations seemed thunderously loud by comparison. Every officer present understood that they were no longer dealing with a junior enlisted sailor seeking food and attention, but with an internationally recognized artist whose presence aboard their ship represented circumstances they could not begin to comprehend. "The reason I enlisted in the Navy," Marcus continued, his voice gaining the kind of measured authority that comes from absolute confidence in one's position, "has nothing to do with needing career opportunities or educational benefits. I am conducting a comprehensive sociological study in collaboration with researchers from Harvard University and the Brookings Institution, examining how institutional prejudice affects the recognition and development of exceptional talent within American military organizations." Captain Chin felt the pieces of an elaborate puzzle falling into place in his mind with crystalline clarity. "The documentary project," he said, understanding dawning in his voice. "You're documenting our responses and behaviors." Marcus nodded with a slight smile that carried no malice but considerable satisfaction at having successfully maintained his cover identity for so long. "Exactly, sir. This is the 14th military installation where I have conducted this experiment, attending social events and formal gatherings while concealing my background and credentials to observe how service members treat individuals they perceive as inferior based solely on rank, appearance, and assumptions about social class. The implications of this revelation were staggering for everyone present. Commander Sterling realized with growing horror that her behavior throughout the evening had been documented and analyzed by researchers whose findings would likely be published in academic journals and policy reports that could influence military personnel practices for decades to come. "Hidden recording equipment," Marcus confirmed, anticipating the question that was forming in multiple minds simultaneously. "High-definition audio and video systems, along with biometric monitoring to assess physiological responses to various types of social interaction. Everything that has occurred here tonight has been documented with the same precision used in clinical psychological research." Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, who had remained largely silent throughout the evening's events, finally found his voice. "This is entrapment. You can't conduct research on military personnel without informed consent and proper authorization through the chain of command. Actually, Captain Chin interjected with a tone that mixed admiration with rueful acknowledgement of his own oversight. All personnel signed comprehensive media and research releases when they reported aboard ship. The documentation clearly states that activities aboard naval vessels may be recorded and analyzed for purposes including academic research, documentary production, and policy development. He smiled grimly. I suspect most officers never read the fine print in their service agreements, despite our constant emphasis on attention to detail. The wardroom erupted in nervous conversation as officers began whispering frantically to each other, many already reaching for their phones to review documentation they had signed months or years earlier without careful consideration. The panic was palpable and spreading through the compartment like wildfire, as career military personnel contemplated the possibility that their professional reputations might be damaged by behavior they had never expected to be subject to external scrutiny. The first phase of our research, Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing chaos around him, focuses on how exceptional capabilities and potential are systematically overlooked when they are packaged in forms that contradict institutional expectations and prejudices. The second phase examines how individuals who claim to embody military values, such as honor, integrity, and respect for others, actually behave when they believe their actions will have no consequences beyond their immediate social circle. Commander Sterling felt a cold wave of realization wash over her as she contemplated the full implications of her situation. Within days or weeks, her behavior would be analyzed by academic researchers, potentially cited in scholarly publications, and quite possibly used as a case study in military leadership courses at institutions around the world. Captain Chin approached Marcus with the kind of respectful attention he typically reserved for visiting dignitaries and senior flag officers. Mr. Rivera, may I ask what you intend to do with the research data you have collected during your time aboard the Leviathan? The comprehensive study will be published in the Journal of Military Psychology and the American Sociological Review, Marcus explained, with the kind of professional precision that characterized serious academic research. But we also maintain active social media channels where we share shorter documentary segments that illustrate our findings for general audiences. Our most recent video, documenting similar experiments at Fort Carson and Naval Air Station Pensacola, currently has over 4 million views across various platforms. The assembled officers watched in horror as they contemplated the reality that their careers and professional reputations would soon be subject to evaluation by millions of internet users whose judgments might be far harsher than any formal military review process. Commander Sterling, Marcus said, addressing directly the officer who had orchestrated his potential humiliation with such confidence and obvious pleasure. Throughout this evening, you have consistently communicated that people like me lack the value, talent, and credentials necessary to participate in military culture on equal terms with personnel from more conventional backgrounds. His voice gained a strength and authority that seemed to fill the entire wardroom, commanding attention from every person present, regardless of their rank or position within the ship's hierarchy. Tomorrow, military personnel around the world will have the opportunity to evaluate your leadership style and decision-making processes based on video documentation of how you chose to treat someone you perceived as vulnerable and without recourse. Sterling opened her mouth to respond, but found herself unable to produce coherent words as the magnitude of her professional catastrophe became fully apparent. The career trajectory that had seemed so promising just hours earlier now appeared to be heading toward public disgrace and institutional censure. Captain Chin surveyed the wardroom, observing the expressions of panic, shame, and dawning realization on the faces of officers who had spent their careers believing they embodied the highest standards of military professionalism and ethical conduct. How many other military installations have been included in your research project? This represents our 14th data collection site, Marcus replied. And the patterns we have documented are remarkably consistent across all branches of service and geographic regions. Personnel who publicly advocate for military values and claim to support the development of junior service members consistently demonstrate prejudicial behavior when confronted with excellence that emerges from unexpected sources. The young man who had entered the wardroom as a desperate recruit begging for food had transformed into a serious researcher whose work would likely influence military personnel policies for years to come. But more than that, he had become a living embodiment of the complex relationship between individual merit and institutional recognition, forcing everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths about how their own biases and assumptions shaped their treatment of subordinates. The fundamental difference between institutional rhetoric and actual behavior, Marcus continued, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak truth to power through both artistic excellence and rigorous academic research, becomes most apparent when people believe they are interacting with individuals who lack the power or status necessary to hold them accountable for their actions. He turned to face Commander Sterling one final time, his expression reflecting not anger or desire for revenge, but the kind of profound disappointment that comes from witnessing unnecessary cruelty and institutional failure. When I was genuinely homeless for several months after my grandfather's death and before beginning my research career, I learned that human dignity cannot be earned through rank, purchased with money, or inherited through family connections. It can only be demonstrated through how we treat other people when we think no one important is watching. The silence that followed was so profound that individual heartbeats seemed audible throughout the wardroom. Every officer present understood that their words and actions would be evaluated not just by their immediate peers and superiors, but by academics, policymakers, and the general public whose judgments might prove far more consequential than any formal military evaluation process. As Marcus discreetly began collecting small recording devices that had been concealed throughout the wardroom in locations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of surveillance technology and human psychology, a single question hung in the recycled air of the USS Leviathan like an accusation that could not be answered satisfactorily. How many other military leaders had discovered too late that their treatment of subordinates revealed character flaws that would ultimately define their professional legacies and personal worth? The immediate aftermath of Marcus Rivera's revelation was unlike anything the USS Leviathan's wardroom had ever experienced. The elegant gathering that had begun as a celebration of naval tradition and camaraderie had transformed into something approaching a crisis management situation, as career officers contemplated the possibility that their professional reputations might be irreparably damaged by behavior they had never expected to face public scrutiny. Commander Sterling stood frozen near the head table, her mind racing through potential damage control strategies while simultaneously calculating the likely impact on her previously promising career trajectory. The Commodore position she had been considered for would almost certainly be withdrawn once her documented behavior became known to senior leadership, and her current assignment as executive officer might be similarly jeopardized depending on how widely the research findings were disseminated. Captain Chin, meanwhile, found himself grappling with complex emotions that mixed professional admiration for Marcus's research methodology with deep concern about the implications for his own command responsibilities. As the ship's commanding officer, he would ultimately be held accountable for the culture and leadership climate that had produced the evening's events, regardless of his personal behavior during the encounter. "Mr. Rivera," he said, his voice carrying the careful formality he typically reserved for interactions with civilian authorities or congressional representatives. "I must ask whether your research methodology included provisions for protecting the privacy and professional interests of personnel who may have acted inappropriately due to incomplete information rather than malicious intent." The question revealed both his command experience and his growing understanding that the young man before him possessed considerably more power and influence than his enlisted rank would normally suggest. Marcus had demonstrated not just artistic excellence, but sophisticated knowledge of research ethics, media relations, and institutional dynamics that would make him a formidable adversary for anyone who had treated him poorly. Our research protocols were reviewed and approved by institutional review boards at Harvard, the Brookings Institution, and the Department of Defense, Marcus replied with the kind of precise professionalism that characterized serious academic work. All participants have the right to review footage and request redactions for statements or actions that they can demonstrate were not representative of their typical behavior or professional standards. The offer provided some measure of relief for officers who were beginning to contemplate the long-term consequences of their documented words and actions. But it also established Marcus as someone who understood both the ethical complexities of social research and the practical realities of military career management. However, he continued, his voice gaining a subtle edge that suggested the protections he had described were not unconditional, our editorial decisions are ultimately guided by the research objectives and the public interest in understanding how institutional biases affect the recognition and development of exceptional talent within military organizations. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, who had maintained a relatively neutral position throughout the evening's events, stepped forward with the kind of measured approach that characterized effective diplomatic communication. Mr. Rivera, speaking as someone who has genuine appreciation for both classical music and military service, I want to understand how your research findings might be used to improve rather than simply criticize existing institutional practices. The question demonstrated both intelligence and political sophistication, acknowledging Marcus's legitimate research objectives while attempting to establish a collaborative rather than adversarial framework for future interactions. Marcus nodded with obvious respect for the diplomatic approach. Our ultimate goal is policy reform rather than individual punishment, he explained, his tone becoming more collaborative and less confrontational. Military organizations represent some of the most effective institutions for developing human potential in American society, but they also perpetuate certain biases and assumptions that limit their ability to recognize and utilize exceptional capabilities when they emerge from unexpected sources. Captain Chin felt a glimmer of hope that the evening's events might ultimately produce positive outcomes rather than simply career destruction for his subordinates. What specific reforms does your research suggest would be most effective? Marcus smiled with genuine enthusiasm, revealing the passionate advocate for institutional improvement that had motivated his research in the first place. Blind audition processes for specialized positions, comprehensive cultural competency training for leadership personnel, and systematic evaluation of how personnel from diverse backgrounds are identified and developed for advancement opportunities. The suggestions were both practical and politically feasible, reflecting Marcus's understanding that effective reform required working within existing institutional frameworks rather than simply criticizing them from external positions. Several officers exchanged glances that suggested grudging respect for his thoughtful approach to complex organizational challenges. More importantly, Marcus continued, his voice gaining the kind of inspirational quality that suggested natural leadership abilities, military organizations need to develop systematic methods for identifying and nurturing exceptional capabilities regardless of how they are initially packaged or presented. The most valuable personnel are often those whose backgrounds and experiences differ most significantly from conventional expectations. Commander Sterling finally found her voice, though it carried none of the authority and confidence she had displayed earlier in the evening. Mr. Rivera, I want to acknowledge that my behavior tonight fell short of the professional standards I claim to represent. Is there any way to address this situation that might serve your research objectives while allowing personnel who made mistakes to learn from them rather than simply face punishment? The question represented a significant shift from her earlier dismissive attitude, acknowledging both Marcus's legitimate authority as a researcher and her own recognition that her documented behavior would not reflect well on her character or professional competence when subjected to external scrutiny. Marcus considered the question carefully, his expression reflecting the kind of thoughtful analysis that suggested he understood the complex human dimensions of institutional research rather than simply focusing on academic objectives. Our research is ultimately intended to promote positive change rather than destroy individual careers, he said finally. Personnel who demonstrate genuine commitment to improving their leadership approaches and addressing the biases revealed through our documentation may find that the final research products emphasize growth and learning rather than simply documenting failures. The offer provided a pathway for redemption that several officers immediately began to contemplate, recognizing that their futures might depend on their ability to demonstrate genuine personal and professional growth in response to the evening's revelations. Captain Chin stepped forward with the kind of decisive action that had characterized his successful naval career. Mr. Rivera, I would like to propose that the USS Leviathan serve as a pilot program for implementing the institutional reforms your research has identified. We could work collaboratively to develop and test new approaches to personnel recognition and development that might serve as models for other commands throughout the fleet. The proposal was both strategically intelligent and personally courageous, acknowledging the validity of Marcus's research while positioning the ship's leadership team as partners in improvement rather than simply subjects of academic criticism. Marcus's expression brightened with obvious interest and respect for the captain's forward-thinking approach. That would be an unprecedented opportunity to move from research documentation to practical implementation, he replied with genuine enthusiasm. Our academic partners would be extremely interested in collaborating with a command that was willing to pioneer new approaches to talent recognition and development. The conversation continued for another hour as Marcus, Captain Chin, and several other officers began outlining potential collaborative projects that could transform the evening's initial crisis into an opportunity for institutional leadership and positive change. Commander Sterling found herself gradually included in these discussions, her obvious intelligence and administrative experience making her a valuable contributor to implementation planning despite her earlier poor judgment. By the time the gathering finally concluded, the USS Leviathan had committed to serving as a research partner in developing new approaches to personnel management that would be studied and potentially implemented throughout the military. Marcus had agreed to extend his enlistment and serve as a special advisor to the ship's leadership team while continuing his concert career through a flexible scheduling arrangement that recognized both his military service obligations and his artistic commitments. The wardroom that had witnessed such dramatic revelations and personal transformations gradually returned to its normal function as officers departed to begin implementing the changes they had discussed. But the impact of the evening's events would resonate throughout the ship and eventually throughout the entire Navy as word spread about the carrier that had transformed a potential public relations disaster into a pioneering example of institutional learning and adaptation. 6 months later, Marcus Rivera stood on the Kennedy Center's main stage in his Navy dress blue uniform, preparing to perform Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with the National Symphony Orchestra. The audience included not just classical music enthusiasts, but also military personnel from installations around the world who had traveled to Washington to witness what had become known as the Leviathan Concert, a performance that symbolized the Navy's commitment to recognizing and developing exceptional talent, regardless of its source or initial presentation. Commander Victoria Sterling, now serving as the Navy's Director of Personnel Development Innovation, watched from the VIP section alongside Captain Chin and other officers who had become advocates for the institutional reforms that Marcus's research had inspired. Her career, rather than being destroyed by the documented events aboard the Leviathan, had been transformed by her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and dedicate herself to ensuring that future military leaders would be better prepared to recognize and nurture exceptional capabilities in all their forms. The USS Leviathan had become famous throughout the military, not for any combat operations or technical innovations, but for pioneering a new approach to personnel management that identified and developed talent through comprehensive evaluation processes that looked beyond conventional indicators of potential and achievement. The ship's success in this area had led to assignment of the most promising junior personnel from throughout the fleet, creating a cycle of excellence that enhanced both operational effectiveness and individual career development. As Marcus began the opening measures of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece, his performance carried not just the technical excellence and emotional depth that had always characterized his playing, but also the additional dimension that came from understanding how individual achievement could serve larger purposes of institutional improvement and social progress. The young man who had asked to play for food aboard a Navy ship had become a symbol of potential that exists everywhere, waiting for leaders wise enough to recognize it and courageous enough to nurture it regardless of how it initially presents itself. His story had transformed not just his own life and career, but the lives and careers of thousands of military personnel who would benefit from the institutional changes his research had inspired. The final notes of the concerto echoed through the Kennedy Center with a power and beauty that transcended mere musical performance, carrying with them the promise that excellence, when properly recognized and supported, could transform not just individual lives, but entire institutions and the societies they serve. Marcus Rivera had proven that true greatness knows no boundaries of rank, background, or initial appearance. It only requires the courage to reveal itself and leaders wise enough to recognize its transformative power when it emerges from the most unexpected places.